Survival in the Caribbean is a gamble that requires resilience. From hurricanes to Sargassum seaweed, presenting paradise to visitors is a constant struggle against pending natural catastrophe. The ever-looming question is, whose number is up next? With the busiest part of the hurricane season at hand, this episode of Just Saying will look back at the impact of last year's historic devastation and examine the recovery and outlook for 2018. Then I'll bring you up to date on the newest seasonal threat to the region, Sargassum seaweed. Residents of the Caribbean do not bet on if these natural disasters will strike. They gamble on where and how severe they will be. I'm Allison Cardivold. Thank you for joining me for this podcast. It's been a couple weeks longer than I planned on getting it to you, but I went on vacation, did a little research for this, and had a great time in the Caribbean myself. And just I say Caribbean and Caribbean both. You're going to hear it throughout the whole podcast. It's okay. It's whatever feels good, right? Okay, so let's get started here. Caribbean roulette. What does that mean? Well, Caribbean nations must continually play the odds on how nature will impact tourism. With often more than 25% of their GDP at stake, these countries and territories cannot afford to succumb to nature's wrath. But, be it hurricanes or Sargassum seaweed, there always seems to be something on the horizon to threaten and disrupt the region's bottom line. The first thing we have to be clear on is it's bigger than you think. In broad terms, the Caribbean is the geographic area south of Florida in the United States, east of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and Central America, just north of the top of South America, and is rimmed by the West Indies on the east. There are more than 35 territories and countries in this region and some 7,000 islands that many people equate simply with paradise. The Caribbean covers an area of 1,063,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, the distance between Belize, the small Central American country on its western edge, and Barbados, the Caribbean's most eastern nation, is more than 1,900 miles. That's the distance between Salt Lake City, Utah, and Buffalo, New York. So it's pretty big. Like any region that relies on nature's bounty, though, professions there are susceptible to feast or famine. Farmers hoping for rain, but not too much rain. Ski resorts that need fresh powder, but not whiteouts, or even cannery workers waiting for full but sustainable salmon nets to be pulled in, all can relate to an island nation's need for clear skies, calm seas, and clean beaches. The region is home to some 38 million people, but tens of millions more come to visit and feed the economy. In the Caribbean Tourism Organization's latest report, Caribbean destinations received an estimated 30.6 million international tourists in 2017. The World Travel and Tourism Council, WTTC, puts that number at closer to 47 million. That number is 10 million more tourists than residents. Now, the discrepancy there is because they don't all count the same countries. Some count some of the countries on the mainland like Belize, some do not. At any event, there are a lot of tourists per residence that come down into this area. And to visit paradise and to live there are two very different things. As a tourist, you look to be entertained and pampered, to be given a break from the monotony and the worries of your daily life. If you live in paradise, odds are your job depends on making tourists happy, while you juggle those monotonous concerns of everyday life. Living in paradise is not without worry. Right up there at the top of the list has to be winds, rain, and high seas. The Atlantic hurricane season officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. An average hurricane season in the North Atlantic consists of 8 to 11 tropical storms, with 5 to 7 of those that might develop into full-fledged hurricanes. The 2017 hurricane season started early, with the first named storm developing on April 19th and went through November 5th. So it ended a little early too, but there were 18 named storms, and 10 of those storms were hurricanes. 9 of the named systems made landfall somewhere. By any account, it was a catastrophic year. If you would like a visual reminder of just how devastating the damage was, you can go to the website at gistsaying.com, justsaying.com, and go to the episodes extra page and click on Caribbean Roulette. In that article, I have embedded video from the BBC that looks at a couple of islands that the U.S. media didn't pay a lot of attention to because there was plenty for them to look at closer. But it looks at Tortola and Barbuda. And it just represents how thorough the devastation was to these small islands out there in the West Indies. FEMA's after action report for the 2017 season just came out recently, and it says, quote, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria caused a combined $265 billion in damage, and each ranked among the top 5 costliest hurricanes on record. As a result, FEMA coordinated large deployments of federal personnel, both before and after the storm's landfalls, to support response and initial recovery efforts across 270,000 square miles, unquote. That's a really big area. And they are kind of trying to defend themselves because they did take criticism, especially for responses in Puerto Rico. Its report examines the agency's performance during the record-breaking season and states that by the time Harvey, Irma, and Maria blew in, FEMA was already supporting 692 other federally declared disasters. This included its response to historic wildfires in California last year, which is something I think we're going to be talking about in the next podcast. We're going to talk about wildfires out west, so you can look forward to that. But back to hurricanes. The administrator of FEMA, Brock Long, said, quote, I'm extremely proud of how FEMA and the whole community performed under extraordinary circumstances. We are prepared for the 2018 hurricane season and have already applied lessons learned from last year to improve how we as an emergency management community do business. We are driven by continuous improvement and remain committed to helping people before, during, and after disasters, unquote. In U.S. territories and beyond, there was, and in some cases still is, a lot of help needed in the Caribbean. But a lot of progress has been made too. Here's a rundown of 7 island nations that took the brunt of Irma and Maria's wrath. We'll start with a little place called Barbuda. All 1,600 inhabitants of Barbuda were forced to retreat to its sister island, Antigua, after Irma made landfall and Jose was quickly approaching. The 2017 hurricane season left 95% of all homes and businesses on Barbuda damaged or destroyed. Thankfully, Antigua remained intact because people have had to stay there. Just this summer, were some of them able to start moving back to the island. Hurricane Maria also destroyed a third of the Dutch side of St. Martin's, with 90% damage to everything standing there. However, St. Martin's is also one of the islands to make the fastest recovery. Much of the damage was repaired by March. On the website, I embedded pictures that show two different places on St. Martin's where you're looking at the exact same street right after the hurricane and then in March. And the amount of work they did to bring it back is pretty amazing. Irma left 10 people dead in Cuba with extensive power outages and road damage, and the British Virgin Islands were struck by both Irma and Maria, which severely damaged homes, businesses, and infrastructure, even the ability to communicate across its multiple islands. It took 7 days for aid from the UK to start arriving in large enough quantities to really begin making an impact on islands like Tortola. The U.S. Virgin Islands did not escape harm either. First, Irma devastated St. John, St. Thomas, and Water Island, and then right after rescue efforts for those islands were set up on St. Croix, Maria came by and knocked out 70% of the buildings there. Then, of course, there is Puerto Rico. The official hurricane-related death toll there has been said to be 64. But that number is going to rise, probably at least to 1,427, as soon as a new study by the Milken Institute at George Washington University is completed. It was commissioned by Puerto Rico's government. And so they are saying that they will accept the findings that it comes up with. There's been a lot of discrepancy about the death toll from different studies, and part of that is because it's a measurement of when you stop calling something a death by the hurricanes. For example, do you only count deaths because someone drowned or they were hit by a fallen tree, or do you also count people who had heart attacks after the hurricane, but because the power was out and the hospital couldn't help them, they died? It's causing a conversation about should we have a federal standard on saying, okay, this is what we're going to use. Right now, it's up to the states, or in this case, the territory, to calculate those deaths. So that's something that's going on. But going back to Puerto Rico, this U.S. territory had infrastructure problems even before Maria hit, such as an outdated and ill-maintained power grid and an overburdened healthcare system. Officials also estimate nearly half the homes on the island were built on floodplains and without government permits or professional supervision. So the damage was truly catastrophic. FEMA now admits that it underestimated the pre-existing strains on Puerto Rico's government, which had gone bankrupt just 4 months before the storms, meaning it needed even more help than expected. In the last 11 months, billions of aid have poured in from the federal government. Though continued local challenges in government agencies make some recovery efforts slow, the people of Puerto Rico, especially those who rely directly on tourism, they no longer want to be thought of as victims. Some of them have a different message they hope catches on. In this instance, #CoverTheProgress. With the first anniversary of Maria's destruction at hand, residents in the beachfront community of Punta Santiago want the world to know they are ready for visitors. And they want the media to help get that word out. In the article on the website, I have a picture, several pictures there. And the first one has an SOS written in chalk in an intersection. And underneath it in Spanish, it says they need water and food. Right next to it, now 11 months later, there's another picture taken from the air that instead of SOS says welcome in Spanish. and there's a group of people standing around it. And those are the people who are trying to get that hashtag started of cover the progress, because it hurts them. This perception hurts their ability to make a living. But along with the remoteness, the fact that most nations in the Caribbean are poor also exacerbates recovery efforts. The Bahamas are considered to be the wealthiest standalone country in the Caribbean, with an average GDP per capita of about $29,000. The nation of Antigua and Barbuda, the one where the entire island of Barbuda had to be evacuated because of Hurricane Irma, its GDP per capita is $18,400. That is almost 3 times less than the United States when using the same system of measurement. Keep in mind, this is per capita, so the GDP is spread across everyone. There are some people who make a lot more and some people who make a lot less. But if you're poor there, you are making 3 times less than the poor here. And all of these people really worry about how perceptions matter. With tens of billions of aid flowing in from the federal government, there is reason to think that in a few years, Puerto Rico could end up being in better shape than ever before. However, a nation like Antigua and Barbuda that doesn't have a parent country to turn to must look for outside help. They do not have the money to fix this themselves. During the first 6 months of 2018, a relief and recovery project sponsored by the UN and China Aid repaired and replaced the roofs of 302 homes and facilities on Barbuda and strengthened the National Building Code standards in the process. Upon its completion, June 30th, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown, said, quote, "Thanks to the United Nations Development Program and the People's Republic of China, the project exceeded all targeted expectations. This is a model that can be replicated in other countries, providing significant help and stronger resilience against future hurricanes," unquote. Disaster can be seen as an opportunity for both foreign companies and governments. China is following a course similar to what it has taken in Africa, dubbed neocolonialism, where it avoids outward political meddling but uses its money to shape national development to reflect Chinese interests. Poor countries devastated by natural disaster can afford to turn away from seemingly benevolent benefactors, even if their governing styles don't align. Brown has since been quoted as saying that Beijing is filling a hole left by the West's benign neglect. A recent report by the World Travel and Tourism Council states, quote, "The impact of the 2017 hurricane season on the Caribbean's travel and tourism sector was significant, and while the islands which were directly hit were worst affected, other islands which were not in the path of the hurricanes also suffered. A public misconception that the storm struck the entire Caribbean has been damaging to the region," unquote. Based on previous forecasts, the report says that the 2017 hurricane season resulted in a loss of 826,000 visitors that would have generated $741 million and supported some 11,000 jobs. The WTTC's research estimates that the recovery could take 4 years. And if this is the case, it will cost the Caribbean more than another $3 billion. So perception is an ongoing challenge to the recovery process. The belief, due to media coverage, that damage was suffered equally across the entire region has caused some visitors to seek alternative vacation destinations altogether. The chair of the Caribbean Tourism Organization said that without exception, all CTO travel partners called after the storm and said, "Well, we've heard the Caribbean is closed." Frustrated by this misperception, CTO Chair Joy Jabruli said, quote, "If a storm happens in New York, no one would say, 'I'm not going to Toronto.' They just would not. It just doesn't make sense," unquote. So what they would like you to do is explore the alternatives. If you fear your favorite island can't meet your needs, people in the Caribbean would like you to remember there are thousands of others from which to choose. After a trip this month to Belize, I can tell you firsthand, even though it was a record-breaking year for hurricanes, last year's storms did not damage all Caribbean countries. As I mentioned earlier, it is a much broader region than you think. For instance, tourism in Belize is on the rise. Local business owners on Ambergris Caye told me they saw an increase in bookings during and right after last year's hurricanes as people tried to shuffle their prior plans. However, tourism in Belize has been growing steadily on its own merits, at least in part due to increased flight capabilities at the country's international airport, increased capital investments, and a strengthening U.S. economy. Numbers from the Belize Tourism Board show a steady incline in tourism to Belize every year since 2011. The World Travel and Tourism Economic Impact Report for 2018 says that travel and tourism are expected to attract another 9.2% increase in capital investment in Belize by the end of 2018. I can tell you Belize has changed a lot since I first traveled there in 2006. Admittedly, I'm biased, but I love it there. With the second longest barrier reef in the world off its coast and more than 200 islands, it's no wonder its people consider themselves to be more Caribbean than Central American. Yet the mainland also has jungles and Mayan ruins, with more and more eco-tourism opportunities scattered throughout all the time. But perhaps what I enjoy the most there is the fact that people are still mainly working for themselves and not for foreign corporations. They're really friendly. And I attribute that to the fact that they're working their own businesses. I think that goes a long way in how much you appreciate tourism dollars when they come in. The people are also very industrious, and they embody the resilience and spirit needed to succeed in a place like the Caribbean. It's a good alternative if you're worried that the normal places you go to out in the West Indies can't accommodate your needs for a couple of years. Now, let's go on to this year's hurricane forecast. The good news is that on August 9th, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, lowered its hurricane season predictions. NOAA now says that El Niño is, quote, much more likely to develop with enough strength to suppress storm development during the latter part of the season. It says a combination of cooler sea surface temperatures across the tropical Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, as well as stronger wind shear with drier air, have helped to suppress storm development so far this summer. However, NOAA cautions that storms can be unpredictable and people in the region should remain ever vigilant. You don't have to look any further than last year to be reminded that big storms can come late in the season. Just think about that. For 6 months out of every year, the very thing that attracts many of the tourists to come to spend their money on your services might form into a massive storm and blow or flood you right out of existence. That's a hard way to make a living. So halfway through the 2018 hurricane season, it is a relief that there have only been 5 named storms, none of which have caused the region serious trouble. However, residents are not yet in the clear. Even if the coming months don't bring big storms to their shores, the water is bringing a golden tide that can also choke out tourism. there is now a new threat you must accept in order to live in the Caribbean. If it's not one thing, it's another, right? Sargassum is the latest natural phenomenon that Caribbean nations must battle as an adversary. The golden brown, free-floating seaweed is currently washing ashore on beaches from Barbados to Cancun. Unsightly, thick blankets of it make beaches impassable for swimmers and boaters, choking coastal marine life and assaulting the olfactory senses of anyone downwind. The mayor of Cancun says tourism is down 35% due to the seaweed invasion this year. Piles almost 10 feet high are coming ashore along the Yucatan coastline, where officials say they've removed more than 104 cubic yards of the stuff just between June 22nd and July 22nd. Starting with Barbados back in June, the seaweed has now drifted the more than 2,000 miles to Mexico, prompting some officials there to call for it to be declared an international emergency. Here's the thing about sargassum. It is a vital part of the ocean's ecosystem that only recently became a cause for coastal crisis. Tons and tons and tons of it are assaulting beaches in places that before 2011, it was previously unseen. It reappeared in force in 2015 and is here again in 2018. At first, everyone hoped it was a one-off event. Now efforts are underway to understand what is causing it and to determine the best ways to deal with it. Scientists say they don't yet have enough data because until recently it was best known for just floating about the Sargasso Sea. The Sargasso Sea is the world's only sea without coastlines. Instead, major currents determine its boundaries. It is located in the North Atlantic and bound by the Gulf Stream on the west, the North Atlantic Current on the north, the Canary Current on the east, and the North Equatorial Current on the south. It's out there, mostly clear and calm, like the eye of a hurricane, with currents swirling clockwise about it in a giant oval, or ocean gyre, as it's called. It is more than 700 miles wide and 2,000 miles long, and the only point of land located in its boundaries is Bermuda, at its very western edge. It was first written about by Christopher Columbus when he encountered Sargassum in 1492. His Portuguese sailors thought the small air bladders that keep it afloat look a lot like a grape species they were familiar with, and coined the name after that grape. These sailors also created the first myths and legends about the Sargasso Sea, the precursors to those of the Bermuda Triangle, which lies right on the bottom west edge of it. This happened after the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria were stranded for 3 days in the doldrums there. In their experience, the sailors knew seaweed to indicate that shallow water and even land must be nearby. So they were fearful of running aground or becoming stuck in the thick patches of the free-floating sargassum. The seaweed itself wasn't a danger, but the area is known for its lack of surface winds that suddenly change with little warning to become gale-force storms. The waters of the Sargasso Sea are clear and scant on nutrients, similar to a desert. But the sargassum seaweed is like a floating jungle. It's rich in nutrients and microscopic organisms. The sargassum is home to 145 types of invertebrates and 127 kinds of fish. There are 10 species endemic to the seaweed, meaning they aren't found anywhere else on Earth, including a few that have evolved coloring and appendages that look like the sargassum. If you want to take a look at some of the critters who live there, go to the website where I have embedded video of them in the article. Along with the permanent residents, migrating populations such as seabirds, whales, turtles, eels, and most of the large sporting fish seek shelter and food there among the floating rafts of seaweed along their travels. Some fish lay their eggs within the mats to incubate, and baby turtles use them as a nursery, spending years within these living, ever-shifting oases while they mature. Traditionally, as small patches of sargassum approach land, reef fish feed on all the inhabitants within the weeds. Then the vegetative part of the weed mixes with the sand to help hold dunes in place. This process has been going on for ages, actually forming the Bermuda stone that built the island of Bermuda. So what's the problem? It's natural, right? The problem isn't that there's sargassum in open water. The problem is its origin isn't the Sargasso Sea, that it's forming at record levels, and that this unprecedented amount is being carried ashore by currents. When it collects in coves, bays, and on shorelines, it robs the fisheries there of sun and oxygen and kills them. When it stacks up on the beach, people and even marine life, like turtle hatchlings, struggle to make their way across it to the water. Once in shallow waters, the sargassum quickly dies and starts to decompose. It turns the water to the color of rust, and it can promote blooms of harmful bacteria and microbes that can irritate the skin. And did I mention that during this process, it smells like sewage? It's awful. Not at all conducive to tourism. When I was in Belize, there was some coming ashore, but nothing compared to what Barbados and Cancun, for example, are seeing, or even Florida. They were able to rake it up, but even in small amounts, if it was on a section of beach that's unattended, you did not want to stay there because the smell was so bad. Raking small amounts of seagrass or weed off of beaches each day is one thing. Some resorts have done this for decades, but what is occurring now is on a whole different scale. Barbados had to declare a national crisis and bring in the military to try and clean it up. Government officials ordered heavy equipment to be brought in to remove the estimated 50,000 tons of seaweed that will wash up on their shores this year. Most don't like this as a long-term solution, though. There is too much of the stuff to bury in the sand, and too much sand is lost when it's scooped up to transport off the beach. So now various countries and resorts are starting to look at water-based options that would allow them to deflect or collect the sargassum while it's still offshore. Containment boom systems and even skimming equipment might be viable solutions in places where the surf isn't too rough. I put a video of one of these machines on the website in the article, and it's kind of crazy looking. It looks like a pontoon boat with conveyor belts on the front of it that dip down into the water and pull all of the seaweed right out of the water, drain off the water, and then onto a deck where it's bagged in nets. It's pretty inventive, but I'm sure it's also quite expensive. And so these different places are going to have to figure out the cost and reward of that. But even when you do this, the problem still remains, what do you do with it? Out of necessity, it seems Barbados is leading a charge to be innovative. Officials there have enlisted the sugar growers on the island to try and retrofit and utilize their loaders and conveyor belts to move the seaweed more efficiently. They are also researching the possibility of harvesting it from the water before it breaks down so they can use it as a source of biomethane gas energy, fertilizer, and compost. They hope this sea post, as they are calling it, can be used to grow crops like grapes that they usually have to import. Once it's cleaned of salt and dried, it's supposed to be a good nutrient base to grow things. Kirk Humphrey, Minister of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy for Barbados, says they just need some more time to figure out the best solution to deal with what many fear may become a yearly onslaught. Meanwhile, scientists at the University of Southern Miami have been researching how to determine the origin of the seaweed and how to track it. Back in 2011, most assumed that the Sargassum was coming from the Sargasso Sea. New research, however, now points to something different. By learning how to revise satellite images, scientists at USM's Optical Oceanography Laboratory were able to backtrack previous occurrences and predict the course of this year's bloom. It started in the spring off the coasts of Africa and South America, and then flowed with the current north to the Caribbean, continuing to grow more abundant along the way. This seaweed is asexual, by the way, so it just reproduces as it goes. Until finally it made its way into the Gulf of Mexico and also up onto the coast of Florida. Scientists say more research must be done to determine why this is happening, but the proximity of blooms to the mouths of the Gambia River in Western Africa and the Amazon River system in South America point to the possibility that runoff high in fertilizer may be at least in part to blame. Dust high in iron and nutrients blowing off the Sahara Desert during its seasonal haze episodes is another possible contributing factor. Then, of course, changes in currents and water temperatures must also be examined. Those studying the phenomenon say more data must be gathered before a definitive cause can be named. In the meantime, what the people of the Caribbean know is that whether the Sargassum comes every year or every few years, they must figure out how to live with it, just like they live with hurricanes. So here's the gist. The Caribbean has no choice but to continue to play its own form of Russian roulette with nature. Storms and seaweed will both continue to come to its shores. The hope is that those who do get hit can rebuild stronger and better than before, and if there are viable ways to prevent the severity down the line, they'd be thankful to accomplish that as well. The good news for tourists is the area is big enough that, at least so far, there's always some place that isn't immediately impacted by a storm or waves of seaweed. The final piece to this is that the people who live there will not give up. They are resilient and adaptable. They are also gamblers who genuinely believe that the next spin of the wheel is bound to go their way. Next up, I will be talking about wildfires in the West and examining how decisions made decades ago actually set us up for the disasters we're facing today. There are a lot of different ways that you could be listening to this podcast, so if you could please, before you go, follow the podcast, follow the website, follow Facebook, Twitter. There's lots of options. If you'll follow somewhere, I can figure out who exactly is watching so I know what you'd like to hear about. Until next time, this is Allison Cardivold, and remember, as always, it is okay to agree or disagree because I'm just saying.